Blood soaked through the sterile stainless steel table, pooling faster than the frantic veterinary team could wipe it away. At the center of the chaos lay 85 pounds of lethal, Navy-trained muscle, a German Shepherd designated K988B, call sign Titan. He was dying from jagged shrapnel wounds that had shredded his left flank. Yet, despite the catastrophic blood loss and failing organs, Titan was a monster unleashed. He snapped his bloodied jaws, shattering a surgical tray, fighting off the very medics trying to save his life. Euthanasia was minutes away. Then, a 22-year-old rookie stepped through the clinic doors and whispered a phrase no one expected. Titan was not just a dog. Within the secretive corridors of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, he was a ghost. Bred in a highly classified facility in Lackland Air Force Base and cross-trained by top-tier operators, the black and tan German Shepherd possessed an intellect that bordered on the uncanny. His handler, Senior Chief Petty Officer Arthur Artie Hayes, used to joke that Titan didn't just understand English. He understood the grim, unspoken arithmetic of war. Artie and Titan were inseparable. Where Artie went, the dog followed. A silent shadow draped in custom Kevlar and tactical optics. They communicated in micro-gestures, a twitch of Artie's fingers, a subtle shift in his stance, a specific exhalation of breath. To the rest of the squadron, Titan was a weapon. To Artie, he was a brother who simply happened to have 4 legs and a bite force of 238 pounds per square inch. The incident that broke them happened during a moonless, freezing night operation in the Zabul province of Afghanistan. Intelligence had pinpointed a high-value target operating out of a fortified compound nestled deep within a treacherous ravine. The insertion was flawless. The SEALs, cloaked in the eerie green hue of their night vision goggles, moved like water over the rocky terrain. Titan was at the point, his nose mapping the invisible landscape of explosives and enemy combatants. Everything went to hell in the span of 3 seconds. As they breached the primary courtyard, the compound didn't just wake up, it exploded. It was a baited ambush. Hidden hostiles opened fire from elevated positions, raining down a relentless hail of 7.62 millimeters rounds. In the ensuing chaos, a concealed, improvised explosive device detonated near the main gate. The blast wave threw Artie backward against a reinforced mud brick wall. Shrapnel tore through the air like a swarm of razor blades. Titan, acting on pure, unadulterated instinct and years of rigorous protection training, lunged toward his handler, interposing his massive body between Artie and the secondary blast of a fragmentation grenade. The dog took the brunt of the steel rain along his left side, but it wasn't enough to save the senior chief. Artie sustained a catastrophic wound to his neck and chest. When the extraction team finally suppressed the enemy fire and secured the courtyard, they found a scene that would haunt the hardened operators for the rest of their lives. Titan, bleeding profusely from deep, jagged lacerations along his flank and hindquarters, was standing astride Artie's motionless body. The dog's eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were wide with a primal, frantic terror. As the unit medic rushed forward to tend to Artie, Titan did the unthinkable. He bared his teeth and let out a guttural, vibrating snarl that froze the medic in his tracks. The dog had snapped. The trauma, the overwhelming scent of his handler's blood, and the deafening noise of the firefight had triggered a psychological short circuit. Titan no longer recognized his teammates. In his shock-addled mind, every human approaching his fallen handler was a threat that needed to be eliminated. It took 3 operators and a heavy dose of field sedatives shot from a distance just to safely separate the dog from Artie's body so the medevac chopper could load the casualties. Artie was pronounced dead before they even reached the airspace over the regional medical facility. Titan survived the flight, but the dog that landed at the trauma center was not the highly disciplined K9 operator they knew. He was a broken, cornered wild animal, locked in an endless loop of defense and grief. 2 weeks later, the gray, salty fog rolled over Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in California, mirroring the grim atmosphere inside the Department of Defense military work. Titan had been stabilized just enough in Germany to survive the transatlantic flight, but his condition was deteriorating rapidly. The shrapnel embedded in his left hip and abdomen was causing severe necrotic tissue damage. Sepsis, the silent killer, was beginning to creep into his bloodstream. His temperature was spiking, his heart rate was erratic, and he was refusing all food and water. But the medical crisis wasn't the primary problem. The problem was that Titan would not allow a single living soul to touch him. "Doctor," Rachel Aris, the senior veterinary surgeon and one of the most respected trauma specialists in the military, stood outside Titan's reinforced steel recovery kennel, her face pale with exhaustion and frustration. Her medical scrubs were stained with a mixture of antiseptic iodine and the dog's blood from their latest, failed attempt to change his bandages. "He ripped the IV out again," Dr. Aris said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke to Captain David Miller, the base commander. "He shattered the protective cone, tore through the secondary bindings, and when my lead tech tried to use a catch pole to secure him, Titan nearly bit cleanly through the aluminum shaft." Captain Miller, a stern man with lines of heavy burden etched into his face, stared through the reinforced plexiglass. Inside the dimly lit enclosure, Titan was huddled in the farthest corner. The dog's breathing was heavy and ragged. His coat, once a gleaming black and mahogany, was matted with dried blood and dirt. The moment Captain Miller shifted his weight, Titan's head snapped up. Even severely weakened, the dog's lips curled back, exposing his lethal canines, and a deep, rumbling growl vibrated through the glass. It was a sound devoid of fear. It was pure, defensive rage. "Can't you dart him?" Captain Miller asked softly. "Put him completely under?" "We've tried, Doctor," Aris replied, running a hand through her stressed hair. "His system is flooded with so much adrenaline and cortisol that standard sedatives are burning off in minutes. To give him a dose strong enough to put him down safely for surgery. With his current blood pressure and the creeping sepsis, his heart will stop. He will die on the table," she sighed, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. "He's in agonizing pain, Captain. The wounds are festering. He needs immediate, invasive surgery to remove the remaining steel fragments and excise the necrotic tissue. But to do that, I need to administer a delicate, slow-drip, localized block and general anesthesia. I need him calm. I need him to accept treatment. And if he doesn't?" Dr. Aris swallowed hard, looking away from the dog. "If we can't get him onto an operating table by 1800 hours tonight, the infection will reach his major organs. At that point, the most humane action we can take, the only ethical action, is lethal injection via dart. We cannot let him suffer like this. He deserves a dignified end, not a slow, agonizing death in a cage." The words hung in the sterile air of the clinic, heavy and final. Euthanizing a Tier 1 working dog was a tragedy under any circumstances. Euthanizing a hero who had thrown himself onto a grenade to save his handler felt like a profound, unforgivable betrayal. Word of Titan's impending fate spread through the base like wildfire. The SEAL community is tight-knit, a brotherhood forged in the fires of impossible adversity. The loss of Artie Hayes was already a devastating blow. Losing his canine partner, the last living piece of Artie's legacy, was a bitter pill no one wanted to swallow. Veteran handlers from across the base came to try their luck. Men with decades of experience taming the most aggressive working dogs in the military stood before Titan's cage, speaking in calm, authoritative tones, offering high-value treats, using every psychological trick in the K9 training manual. Nothing worked. Titan lunged at the glass, his growls echoing down the tiled hallways, a heartbreaking display of loyalty and shattered trust. He was waiting for Artie, and until Artie walked through those clinic doors. By 1700 hours, the clinic was quiet. The veteran handlers had retreated, their heads bowed in defeat. Doctor Aris was in her office, quietly preparing the fatal dosage in a specialized dart gun, tears streaming down her face. The clock was ticking down to 1,800. Petty Officer Second Class Connor Davies sat on the edge of his rack in the barracks, staring blindly at a scuffed pair of combat boots. Connor was 22, relatively fresh out of the grueling selection process of BUD-S, and officially the newest and currently most useless member of the squadron. 2 weeks ago, during a complex underwater demolition training exercise off the coast of San Clemente Island, a miscalculated charge had detonated prematurely. Connor had been caught in the periphery of the pressure wave. He suffered a severely blown eardrum and minor concussive trauma. He wasn't medically discharged, but he was benched. Placed on indefinite light duty, while his hearing recovered, Connor was relegated to sorting logistics, filing mission reports, and sweeping the armory. In a community defined by action and brotherhood, being sidelined felt like a slow, suffocating death. The older guys called him the washout, partly as a joke, but to Connor's hypercritical mind, it felt like an accurate title. He felt entirely disconnected from the war, from the squadron, and from his own purpose, until he heard about the dog. Connor hadn't been in Zabul. He hadn't been on the raid that killed Artie Hayes. But he knew Artie. During the darkest, coldest nights of Hell Week, when Connor's body was shutting down, when the hallucinations were setting in, and when the urge to ring the brass bell and quit was screaming in his mind, Artie Hayes had been the instructor walking the line. Artie was tough, brutal even. One night, while Connor was shivering uncontrollably in the surf zone, ready to give up, Artie had knelt down in the sand beside him. He didn't yell. He didn't mock him. "Pain is just information, Davies," Artie had whispered over the roar of the ocean. "It's your body telling you it's scared. You don't listen to the fear. You listen to the frequency underneath it. You find the anchor." Later, after Connor had miraculously earned his trident, he had run into Artie at a local bar in Coronado. Artie had been sitting in a back booth, nursing a beer, with Titan resting his massive head on the operator's boots. It was a rare, quiet moment, and Artie had invited the new guy to sit. They had talked for hours, mostly about Titan. Connor, who had grown up on a farm raising stubborn cattle dogs, was fascinated by the sheer intensity of the SEAL K9S. "People think training these animals is about dominance," Artie had said, scratching the spot right behind Titan's left ear. "It's not. It's about a shared language. They don't speak English, Davies. They don't care about your rank or your ribbons. They speak frequency, intent, and trust." Artie had taken a sip of his beer, his eyes taking on a distant, reflective look. Titan is too smart for his own good. Sometimes, in the middle of a hot zone, the noise gets to be too much. The gunfire, the screaming, the explosions. He gets overloaded. His instinct is to fight everything. "How do you snap him out of it?" Connor had asked. Artie had leaned in close, a small, secretive smile on his face. "I gave him an anchor, a verbal reset button. It's not in the manual. The brass doesn't know about it. It's just between him and me." Artie had tapped his temple. It interrupts his brain's threat response loop, reminds him that no matter how chaotic the world is, I'm his fixed point. Connor snapped back to the present, the memory echoing in his ringing ears. He looked at the digital clock on his nightstand. Schutziden Arschewufen. 35 minutes until Dr. Eris pulled the trigger on the euthanasia dart. Connor grabbed his jacket and bolted out of the barracks. His heart hammered against his ribs as he sprinted across the concrete pathways of the base, dodging slow-moving supply trucks and groups of sailors. The damp California air stung his lungs, but he pushed harder, ignoring the dull ache radiating from his healing ear. He didn't know if he was crazy. He didn't know if Artie's drunken bar talk was a literal truth or just the poetic rambling of a veteran operator. But he knew he couldn't sit in his room while Artie's best friend was put down like a rabid animal. Connor burst through the double doors of the veterinary clinic at 1740. The reception area was empty, bathed in the harsh, sterile glow of fluorescent lights. He rushed down the main hallway, toward the high-security ward. Outside Titan's kennel, Dr. Eris was making final preparations. 2 burly military police officers stood nearby, their faces grim, ready to assist with the physical removal of the body once it was over. The heavy, pressurized dart gun rested on a stainless steel cart. "Stop," Connor yelled, his voice cracking slightly as he skidded to a halt in front of the doctor. Dr. Eris jumped, her hand instinctively moving toward her chest. "Petty officer? What are you doing back here? This area is restricted right now. You can't do this," Connor panted, leaning against the glass of the enclosure to catch his breath. "You can't put him down." "Son, I don't want to," Dr. Eris said gently, noting the young man's distress. "But he is dying. His temperature is 105 degrees. He's in septic shock. I cannot treat him without killing him in the process, because he won't let us near him. It's over." Inside the cage, Titan had hauled himself up. The sudden commotion had triggered him again. He was standing on 3 legs, his wounded hindquarter trembling violently. Blood seeped fresh from his bandages, dripping onto the pristine floor. He lunged at the reinforced glass right where Connor's hand was resting, snapping his jaws with a terrifying crack. The MPs stepped forward nervously. "Hey, back away from the glass, kid," one of them warned. "Give me 5 minutes," Connor demanded, ignoring the MPs and locking eyes with Dr. Eris. "Let me go in there." Dr. Eris stared at him in disbelief. "Absolutely not. Are you out of your mind? He nearly tore a veteran handler's arm off 2 hours ago. You're not even a K-9 unit. You're... She glanced at his uniform, recognizing the insignia but noting his youthful face. You're a junior operator. If you go in there, he will maul you, and then I will have to shoot him anyway, to save your life. The answer is no. I know his reset, Connor said, his voice dropping to a desperate, urgent pitch. I know Artie Hayes' verbal anchor. Dr. Eris froze. She knew the bond between handlers and their dogs was deeply personal, often involving proprietary commands. But every command in Titan's official file had been exhausted by the master trainers earlier that day. What are you talking about? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Artie told me. Connor lied slightly, making it sound more official than a late-night bar conversation. He has a specific code, a phrase meant to pull him out of combat psychosis. Let me try it. Open the door. Let me step inside. If he charges me, you have the dart gun right there. Shoot him. But if it works, if I can calm him down, you can save him. Doctor. Eris looked from the desperate young SEAL to the aggressive, dying dog in the cage, and then down to the heavy dart gun on the cart. She was a woman of science, of protocol. Opening that door violated every safety regulation in the military code. It was a court-martial offense if the kid got maimed. Wushifen. Titan let out another hollow, agonizing cough, his body swaying weakly before he braced himself against the wall, still baring his teeth. 2 minutes, doctor, Eris whispered, her voice tight with fear and a tiny, foolish sliver of hope. She turned to the MPs. Rifles at the low ready. If that dog makes a move to tear his throat out, you put the animal down. Understood? The MPs nodded rigidly, unholstering their sidearms and taking positions flanking the kennel door. Connor took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, picturing Artie's face in the freezing surf of Hell Week. Listen to the frequency underneath it. Dr. Eris punched the security code into the keypad. A heavy, electronic click echoed through the hallway. She grabbed the heavy steel handle of the kennel door. Ready, petty officer? Ready, Connor said. Dr. Eris pulled the heavy door open just enough for a man to slip through. The immediate smell hit Connor like a physical blow. The metallic tang of blood, the sharp chemical odor of infection, and the distinct, musky scent of a predator operating on pure fear. Connor stepped into the iron cage. The door slammed shut behind him with a resonant, terrifying clang. Titan did not retreat. Despite the massive blood loss and the fever visibly racking his muscular frame, the German shepherd squared his shoulders. His ears flattened entirely against his skull, and his lips peeled back to reveal gums pale from shock and canines stained with his own dried blood. A low, vibrating growl started deep within his chest, a sound less like an animal and more like a revving chainsaw engine about to bite into hardwood. It was a clear, unmistakable promise of violence. Outside the reinforced glass, Dr. Rachel Eris held her breath, her hand hovering agonizingly close to the handle of the dart gun. The two military police officers raised their M4 carbines, their knuckles white, the red dots of their sights dancing nervously on the glass. Connor knew the first rule of K9 engagement. Dogs do not just smell fear. They read the microscopic shifts in your physiology. They hear the spike in your heart rate. They see the micro-contractions of your facial muscles. If Connor acted like prey, he would become prey. If he acted like a threat, Titan would defend himself to the death. He had to become an anchor. Connor deliberately broke eye contact. Staring a dominant, aggressive dog in the eyes was a challenge, a provocation he would instantly lose. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on Titan's bleeding left shoulder, softening his posture. He slowly sank to one knee, lowering his center of gravity to appear less imposing. The concrete floor was cold through his uniform trousers. Titan's growl hitched, rising in pitch as he prepared to lunge. The dog's powerful hind legs, even the one mangled by shrapnel, bunched with coiled energy. Pain is just information, Connor whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the roaring in his own ears. He closed his eyes, filtering out the harsh fluorescent lights, the terrified faces of the medical staff behind the glass, and the overwhelming metallic stench of blood. He transported himself back to that freezing night in the Coronado surf, back to the exhausted delirium of Hell Week, back to the exact cadence and tonal frequency of Artie Hayes. When Connor opened his eyes, Titan was mid-shift, throwing his weight forward to strike. Connor raised his right hand, palm flat and facing the floor, a universal gesture of grounding. Then, from the deepest part of his chest, he projected a voice that wasn't entirely his own. It was a perfect, eerie imitation of Artie's gravelly, authoritative baritone. "Echo 7, Connor commanded, his voice slicing through the thick air of the kennel. "Hold the line." Broken arrow. The effect was instantaneous and violently abrupt. Titan froze mid-lunge. His front paws slammed into the concrete, his claws scrabbling for purchase as he abruptly halted his own forward momentum. The vicious growl died in his throat, replaced by a sharp, confused whimper. Connor didn't move a muscle. He kept his hand extended, palm down. He took a slow, deep, exaggerated breath in through his nose and let it out through his mouth, the exact breathing exercise Artie used to slow his own heart rate after a firefight. "Broken arrow, Titan," Connor repeated, softening the edge of the command, pouring every ounce of calm conviction he possessed into the words. "I have the watch." Titan's head snapped from side to side, his amber eyes wide and searching. The dog's brain, currently a chaotic storm of trauma, pain, and defensive instincts, was violently colliding with his deepest conditioning, broken arrow. The ultimate override code Artie had embedded in Titan's psyche during countless hours of secret, off-the-books training. It meant the fight was over. It meant the perimeter was secure. It meant surrender to the handler. But Artie wasn't here, only this stranger. Yet, the stranger sounded exactly like home. He felt like the anchor. A agonizing silence stretched across the clinic. Outside the cage, Dr. Eris slowly lowered her hand from the dart gun, her mouth parted in stunned disbelief. Inside, the internal war raging within the K9 finally broke. The fight instantly drained out of Titan. His massive head dropped, and the tension left his jaw. The dog let out a long, shuddering sigh that sounded heartbreakingly human. His mangled back leg finally gave out, and Titan collapsed onto the concrete, his nose resting inches from Connor's knee. He didn't growl. He didn't snap. He simply closed his eyes and let out a soft, high-pitched whine of total defeat and unbearable pain. Connor exhaled, his own body trembling with the massive dump of adrenaline. He slowly, agonizingly slowly, reached out his hand. He didn't go for the top of the head, a dominant move. He brought his knuckles to the side of Titan's snout, right where the black fur met the tan. Titan leaned into the touch, letting out another pathetic whimper. The monster of Zabul province was gone. In his place was just a broken, grieving dog who desperately needed his pack. "I got you, buddy," Connor whispered, a lump forming in his throat as his fingers brushed through the matted fur. "I got the watch." Connor looked up over his shoulder at the reinforced glass. He gave Dr. Eris a sharp, single nod. "Bring the sedatives." Now, chaos erupted with terrifying precision. The kennel door swung open, and Dr. Eris rushed in, flanked by her lead surgical technician, Petty Officer First Class Gregory Higgins. They didn't bring catch poles or riot shields. They brought a sterile IV kit, a heavy dose of propofol, and a mobile crash cart. "Keep talking to him, Davies," Dr. Eris ordered, her hands a blur of motion as she knelt on the blood-slicked floor beside the dog. "Keep him anchored. If his heart rate spikes now, his aorta will tear." Connor kept his hand firmly on Titan's neck, stroking the thick fur, maintaining a steady stream of low, rhythmic nonsense, just keeping his voice in that low, Artie-like register. "Easy, big guy. Easy now. Stand down. We're going home." "Stand down." Titan shifted weakly as Higgins tied off a tourniquet on his right foreleg, but he didn't snap. He kept his amber eyes locked on Connor's face, anchoring himself to the only familiar frequency in a terrifying world. "Needle in," Higgins announced. Pushing the induction agent, Dr. Eris said, depressing the plunger on the syringe. 10 seconds. Connor felt the exact moment the powerful anesthetic hit the dog's brain. Titan's eyes rolled back slightly, his heavy head suddenly becoming dead weight against Connor's hand. The ragged, panicked breathing smoothed out into a deep, chemical slumber. "He's under," Dr. Eris breathed, wiping a streak of sweat and blood from her forehead. "Get the gurney. Move. We are losing him." The next 2 hours were a blur of sterile lights, beeping monitors, and the cloying smell of cauterized tissue. They rushed Titan into the primary surgical theater. Connor, His uniform covered in dog hair and blood, refused to leave the room. He stood silently in the corner, out of the sterile field, watching as Dr. Eris and her team fought a desperate battle against the Grim Reaper. The surgery was a nightmare. The shrapnel from the explosive device had acted like a meat grinder. Suction! Give me more suction, Higgins. I can't see the bleeder. Dr. Eris barked, her hands deep inside Titan's open flank. The rhythmic beep-beep-beep of the heart monitor was erratic, too fast and too faint. BP is crashing, Doc. 60, over, 40 and dropping, Higgins warned, his eyes glued to the monitors. The sepsis is causing systemic vasodilation. We need to push pressors. Do it, she snapped, pulling a jagged, thumb-sized piece of twisted steel from the muscle tissue and dropping it into a metal basin with a sharp clink. There's too much necrotic tissue here. The blast wave shattered the femur head and drove debris straight into the peritoneal cavity. Connor watched helplessly. He was trained to neutralize human threats, to breach doors and clear rooms. Watching life slip away on a surgical table was a different kind of horror, one he couldn't shoot his way out of. Suddenly, the heart monitor's erratic beeping flatlined into a solid, high-pitched wail. B. Cardiac arrest! Higgins shouted, slamming a fist onto the crash cart. He's coding! Chest compressions. Higgins, get on the chest. Doctor, Eris yelled, moving back so the technician could leverage his weight over the dog's ribcage. Push epinephrine. 1 milligram IV stat. Higgins began rhythmically driving his palms into Titan's side, the brutal force required to pump blood through the massive animal jarring the entire operating table. Come on, you stubborn bastard. Higgins grunted, sweat pouring down his face. Come on! Connor felt a cold dread wash over him. He stepped forward, breaking the sterile boundary, but nobody stopped him. He grabbed the edge of the surgical table. He remembered the desperate fight in the cage, the sheer willpower Titan had shown. A dog that tough didn't just give up on a table. Don't you quit! Connor growled at the unconscious animal, his voice cracking. Artie didn't die so you could check out on a table. Hold the line, Titan! Broken arrow! Epi is in, a nurse shouted. Clear! Higgins yelled, stepping back. Nothing. The monitor screamed its singular, devastating note. Again! Compressions! Dr. Eris ordered, her eyes wide with panic. Higgins resumed the brutal chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Connor closed his eyes, his grip on the table tightening until his knuckles turned white. Please. Suddenly, the monitor stuttered. Beep, 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 beep. We have a rhythm! Higgins gasped, falling back from the table, chest heaving. Sinus tachycardia. But it's a rhythm. BP is coming back up. Dr. Eris let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She didn't waste a second. She plunged her hands back into the surgical cavity. He's not out of the woods. He is hanging by a thread. I need to close off this femoral artery tear right now or he bleeds out again. For another grueling hour, they worked in hyper-focused silence. Doctor, Eris painstakingly removed 5 more pieces of jagged shrapnel, debrided the dead tissue, and reconstructed the shredded muscle walls as best she could. She pumped him full of broad-spectrum antibiotics to fight the raging infection. When she finally threw the last suture and cut the thread, the surgical clock on the wall read 21:15. Dr. Eris stepped back, stripping off her bloody gloves. She turned to Connor, who was still standing rigidly by the table. He's stabilized, she said quietly, her voice hoarse. But he is in a medically induced coma. The trauma to his body, the sepsis, it's severe. The next 48 hours are critical. If the infection spreads to his heart or brain, we lose him. Connor looked down at Titan. The dog looked smaller now, frail beneath the heavy bandages and the network of tubes keeping him alive. He's a fighter, Connor said, his voice quiet but absolute. He is, Dr. Eris agreed, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. But he gave up the fight against us because of you, Davies. I don't know what that code was, or how you knew it, but you saved his life today. The rest is up to him. Before Connor could process the weight of her words, the heavy doors of the surgical suite pushed open. Captain David Miller walked in, his expression unreadable. He looked at the dog on the table, then at Dr. Eris, and finally settled his hard gaze on the young, blood-stained petty officer. Davies, the captain said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You and I need to have a very long conversation about classified K9 operational protocols. But first, Miller looked back at Titan. First, we secure a recovery room. Because if that dog wakes up, you are the only one he's going to let near him. Captain David Miller stood in the doorway, his dress khaki uniform a stark contrast to the blood-stained, wrinkled fatigues Connor still wore. Miller held a thick manila folder Titan's classified personnel and medical file. In the eyes of the United States Navy, the 85-pound animal lying on the padded floor mat was a piece of serialized, highly sensitive equipment. Petty Officer Davies, Miller began, his voice dropping an octave so as not to disturb the heavily sedated dog. I just got off a secure line with the commander of Naval Special Warfare Group 1. We have a situation. Connor slowly pushed himself up from the cold linoleum, his joints popping. Is it a court-martial? Sir? Miller sighed, tossing the heavy folder onto a stainless steel counter. Technically, you bypassed 4 levels of base security, countermanded a senior medical officer's order, and initiated unauthorized contact with a Tier 1 asset. I could have you mucking out the bilge of a destroyer for the rest of your enlistment. But Dr. Aris logged that your intervention was the sole reason the asset survived the night. So, the brass is willing to overlook the insubordination. For now, the captain stepped closer, his steel-gray eyes locking onto Connor. What they cannot overlook is how a 22-year-old rookie, who washed out of a demolition exercise with a blown eardrum, gained possession of a classified, handler-specific override code. Artie Hayes built that dog from the ground up. He didn't share his methods. So, how did you know it? Connor looked down at Titan. The dog's chest rose and fell in a shallow, mechanical rhythm, aided by a nasal oxygen cannula. Intravenous lines fed a cocktail of broad-spectrum antibiotics and painkillers directly into his jugular. Artie told me, sir. 2 months ago, at McPee's Irish pub, Connor said softly, we were talking about the noise of combat, how it overloads the senses. Artie said Titan's instinct was to fight the chaos. The phrase broken arrow, it wasn't a command. Artie called it an anchor, a frequency. Miller's jaw tightened. A drunken conversation in a bar saved $1 million military asset. Unbelievable. The captain rubbed the bridge of his nose. Here is the reality, Davies. Titan is medically stable, but he is fundamentally broken. His handler is dead. His body is shattered. When the propofol wears off and he wakes up in this room, the pain is going to hit him like a freight train. If he wakes up fighting, he will tear his own sutures out and bleed to death on this floor. He won't fight me, Connor said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. You'd better hope not, Miller replied grimly. Because as of 5 minutes ago, you are officially reassigned. You are no longer on logistics duty. You eat here. You sleep here. If he wakes up and accepts you, we move to rehabilitation. If he rejects you, Dr. Aris has orders to administer the lethal injection immediately. The Navy will not allow him to suffer another psychotic break. Captain Miller turned on his heel and walked out, leaving the heavy weight of an ultimatum hanging in the antiseptic air. At 0300 hours, the mechanical rhythm of the heart monitor shifted. The steady beep fluttered, increasing in tempo. Titan was surfacing from the chemical dark. The dog's eyelids fluttered, revealing groggy, bloodshot amber eyes. Almost instantly, the confusion morphed into panic. Titan tried to lift his massive head, his front paws scrabbling weakly against the medical padding. A low, wet growl started in his throat as the searing pain from his reconstructed flank registered in his brain. The trauma of Zabul, the explosions, the gunfire, the scent of Artie's blood was flooding back, overriding his senses. He didn't know where he was. He only knew he had to fight. Hey! Look at me, Connor commanded, dropping to his knees instantly. He didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He leaned into the dog's line of sight, placing his hand firmly on the uninjured side of Titan's chest. Titan bared his teeth, a terrifying sound vibrating through the quiet room. He snapped his jaws, missing Connor's wrist by a fraction of an inch, his eyes wide and completely feral. Echo 7, Connor barked, channeling every ounce of authority he had. He pitched his voice low, grinding the words out from his chest. Hold the line. Broken arrow. Titan froze. His pupils dilated rapidly. The dog let out a sharp, ragged breath, staring at the young man. The scent was wrong, the face was wrong, but the tone, the unyielding calm amidst the pain, it was the anchor. Broken arrow, Titan. "I have the watch," Connor whispered, his hand sliding up to cup the side of the dog's scarred face. "You're safe. We're holding the perimeter." The fight drained out of the German shepherd like water from a cracked pitcher. Titan let out a long, shuddering whine, his heavy head dropping heavily onto Connor's thigh. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to match the deliberate, exaggerated breaths Connor was taking. Connor sat on the cold floor for the rest of the night, his hand resting on the dog's neck, guarding a ghost. 6 weeks later, the blistering Southern California sun beat down on the restricted K9 training yards of Coronado. Physically, Titan's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Aris's surgical brilliance, combined with the dog's sheer genetic resilience, had saved his leg. He walked with a pronounced permanent limp, and a massive patch of hairless, scarred tissue covered his left flank. But he was alive. Psychologically, however, he was a ticking time bomb. Connor and Titan walked onto the center of the dusty training field. Waiting for them under a canvas canopy was a medical evaluation board consisting of Captain Miller, Dr. Aris, and Chief Warrant Officer John Hendricks, the most feared K9 evaluator in naval special warfare. Hendricks was a mountain of a man with a scarred face and a clipboard that dictated the life or death of every working dog in the fleet. "All right, Davies," Hendricks called out, his voice booming across the yard. "The medical staff says he's healed. The brass says he's a liability. We are here to determine if K988B can be retired to a civilian sanctuary or if his aggression levels are too unpredictable for society. Let's see what you've got." Connor unclipped the heavy lead from Titan's tactical harness. "Heave," Connor commanded softly. Titan immediately sat at Connor's left heel, his amber eyes locked onto the horizon, his posture rigidly perfect. "Basic obedience is intact," Hendricks noted, scribbling on his clipboard. "Now, let's test the startle response. We need to know if loud noises trigger the combat trauma." Hendricks gestured to an assistant standing 30 yards away behind a wooden blind. The assistant raised a starter pistol loaded with blanks and fired 2 rapid shots. Crack! Crack! Titan didn't flinch. His ears swiveled toward the sound, but he remained rooted to the spot, waiting for a command from Connor. "Good," Hendricks grunted. Hendricks himself stepped out from under the canopy. He pulled a padded bite sleeve over his right arm. "I am going to approach aggressively. I will shout. I will raise my arm. If he breaks a sit-stay to attack without a command, he fails. If he attacks and won't release on your command, he fails." Connor felt a bead of sweat roll down his spine. This was the razor's edge. Titan had killed men in combat. He knew what violence looked like. Hendricks charged. He sprinted across the dust, screaming a primal battle cry, raising the padded arm high into the air. Titan's lips peeled back. The terrifying chainsaw growl erupted from his chest. His muscles coiled, his hind paws digging into the dirt. He was a microsecond away from launching 85 pounds of teeth and muscle directly at the evaluator's throat. "Titan, stay," Connor ordered, his voice cracking like a whip. Titan trembled violently. The instinct to destroy the threat was warring with the command of his anchor. Hendricks stopped 5 feet away, lowering the arm. "Good control, Davies. Now, let's see how he handles the unexpected." Hendricks turned to walk back to the canopy. As he did, he deliberately dropped his heavy, metal-backed clipboard onto the hard-packed dirt. Clang! The sharp, metallic sound echoed across the yard. To a normal dog, it was just a dropped object. But to Titan's shattered, traumatized brain, that specific frequency perfectly mimicked the sound of a Kalashnikov rifle bolt slamming forward. It was the exact sound he heard right before the ambush in Zabul, right before Artie died. Titan snapped. There was no growl, no warning. He bypassed Connor entirely, moving with terrifying speed despite his limp. He launched himself through the air, hitting Hendricks square in the back. The sheer kinetic force of the impact drove the 200-pound evaluator face first into the dirt. Panic erupted. Captain Miller yelled. Dr. Aris leaped from her chair, and 2 armed MPs at the edge of the field unholstered their weapons. "Hold your fire!" Connor screamed, sprinting toward the cloud of dust. Hendricks rolled onto his back, raising the padded bite sleeve to protect his face. But Titan didn't bite the sleeve. He bypassed the padding entirely. He planted his massive front paws on Hendrix's chest, pinning the man to the ground, and lowered his jaws directly over the chief warrant officer's exposed throat. Titan's teeth grazed Hendrix's Adam's apple. The dog was vibrating with adrenaline, his eyes unseeing, trapped in a flashback. He was back in the compound. He was neutralizing the threat. "Davies, get him off," Captain Miller roared. "MPs, target the dog." "No, stand down." Connor threw himself to his knees, sliding into the dirt right beside Titan's head. He knew Broken Arrow wouldn't work here. The failsafe was for when Connor was safe. In Titan's mind, the perimeter was breached. Hendrix was the enemy who killed Artie. Connor had to do something Artie had never done. He had to bridge the gap between the dog's past and his present. Instead of pulling Titan back, Connor leaned forward, placing his own body between the MP's line of fire and the dog. He grabbed the thick nylon of Titan's tactical collar. "Titan, look at me!" Connor shouted, not with Artie's low calm, but with his own raw, desperate voice. Titan didn't blink. The dog's jaw tightened, preparing to crush Hendrix's windpipe. Connor didn't use a Navy command. He used a memory from his childhood farm, a command used to snap cattle dogs out of a blood frenzy. He slammed his open palm flat against the dirt, right next to Titan's face, and yelled the one thing the dog hadn't heard since Zabel. "Clear! The threat is clear!" Connor roared, switching back to the exact tonal frequency of Artie Hayes for the final word. "With me!" The combination of the sudden physical shockwave against the dirt and the hybridized command shattered the flashback. Titan blinked. He looked down at the terrified man beneath him, then snapped his head to look at Connor. The feral glaze vanished from his eyes. He realized where he was. He realized Connor was right beside him, unharmed. Instantly, Titan released his dominant stance. He stepped off Hendrix, his head dropping low in submissive confusion, and immediately moved to sit rigidly at Connor's left heel. Silence blanketed the training yard, broken only by Hendrix's ragged, terrified breathing as he scrambled backward in the dirt. Connor kept his hand firmly on Titan's head, feeling the dog's rapid pulse begin to slow. He looked up at Captain Miller and the deeply shaken chief warrant officer. "He didn't bite," Connor said, his voice deadly quiet, echoing across the dusty field. "He had his teeth on your throat, Chief. If he was a broken, aggressive animal, you'd be dead. He didn't bite because he wasn't attacking. He was securing the perimeter. He was protecting me." Hendrix slowly got to his feet, wiping a mixture of sweat and dirt from his face. He stared at the black and tan dog, then at the rookie SEAL, who had just risked his own life to shield the animal from gunfire. Hendrix picked up his dented metal clipboard. His hands were shaking slightly. He looked at Captain Miller. "The dog cannot be retired to a civilian sanctuary, Captain," Hendrix rasped, his voice rough. "He is too highly trained, and his triggers are too specific to combat trauma. A civilian environment would be catastrophic." Captain Miller's face darkened. "Then the board's recommendation is euthanasia." "No, sir," Hendrix said, pulling a pen from his pocket. "My recommendation is that K988B is officially redesignated as a purely defensive asset. He can never deploy to a hot zone again, but he doesn't need to be put down." Hendrix locked eyes with Connor. "Because, as long as Petty Officer Davies is holding the leash, that dog is the most disciplined weapon on this base." Titan was the reason. The massive German Shepherd had physically recovered from the catastrophic shrapnel wounds, though a web of pale, hairless scars mapped his left flank, and a slight, permanent hitch remained in his gait. But Chief Warrant Officer Hendrix had been right. The dog was utterly useless to anyone but Connor. When other handlers tried to run Titan through basic obedience courses, the dog would simply sit, ignore their commands, and stare a hole through them until Connor stepped onto the field. They had become a specialized, solitary unit of two, a ghost team. The Navy brass, unsure of what to do with a highly lethal, non-deployable asset and a stubbornly loyal young operator, had relegated them to high-level base security, a polite term for glorified guard duty. Until the night the encrypted emergency line in Captain David Miller's office lit up red. It was 0130 hours when Connor's barracks door was kicked open. A young ensign stood in the hallway, his face completely drained of color. "Davies, gear up, you and the dog. The commander wants you on the helipad in 5 minutes." Connor didn't ask questions. He threw on his tactical gear, grabbed his customized HK-416 assault rifle, and secured Titan's Kevlar harness. The dog didn't make a sound, but his amber eyes locked onto Connor's face, reading the sudden spike in adrenaline. When they reached the tarmac, the rotors of a modified MH-60 Blackhawk were already spinning, throwing violent sheets of rain across the asphalt. Captain Miller was standing by the open side door, screaming into a satellite radio. "What's the situation, sir?" Connor shouted over the deafening whine of the turbine engines as he lifted Titan into the chopper. "Domestic nightmare!" Miller yelled back, pulling a laminated map from his tactical vest. An hour ago, a heavily armed rogue paramilitary faction breached the Fallbrook Naval Weapons Station. It's an underground munitions bunker complex, 70 miles north of here. They bypassed the outer security grid, killed 2 Marine guards, and took the bunker complex. Connor felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Fallbrook housed experimental ordnance and thousands of pounds of highly unstable C4 and specialized blasting caps. "Hostages?" Connor asked. 6, Miller grimaced. "Civilian defense contractors and the facility's lead engineer, Dr. Thomas Sterling." But that's not the worst part. The faction has wired the primary subterranean access tunnels with acoustic tripwires and localized pressure plates. If standard SWAT or a SEAL breach team tries to blow the doors or stomp down those corridors, the acoustic sensors will detonate the secondary charges. The entire bunker goes up, taking half the hillside, and the hostages with it. So we snipe them? They are 50 feet underground in reinforced concrete corridors. "Davies," Miller snapped. "We have no sightlines. We have no thermal imaging through rock. And we can't use flashbangs or suppressed breaching charges because of the acoustic sensors." Miller looked down at Titan, who was sitting perfectly still, leaning his heavy head against Connor's knee as the helicopter banked hard to the north. "The FBI hostage rescue team is standing by, but they agree with our assessment. Human operators in full tactical gear carry too much mass and make too much noise to slip past those acoustic sensors," Miller explained, his voice tight with desperation. "We need a silent scout, an asset that can navigate a pitch-black, confined space, identify the tripwires by scent or sight, and neutralize the perimeter guards without firing a single shot. We need a ghost." Connor looked at the captain, realization dawning. "Titan is officially benched from hot zones, sir. The evaluation board said his combat trauma triggers make him too unpredictable for an active firefight." "I know what the board said," Miller replied grimly. "But this isn't a battlefield in Zabul. It's a dark hallway in California. Doctor, Eris thinks the dog's hypervigilance, the very thing that makes him a liability in a chaotic war zone, is exactly what we need here. He operates in pure silence, and he listens only to you." The captain leaned closer, the red interior lights of the helicopter casting deep shadows across his face. "Can he do this, Davies?" "If he snaps. If a metallic sound triggers a flashback and he barks or breaks discipline down there, everyone dies." Connor looked down at the German Shepherd. He remembered the blood on the clinic floor, the desperate surgery, and the agonizing months of retraining. He remembered the exact frequency of Artie Hayes' voice. "He won't break," Connor said, his voice absolute. "I have the watch." The Fallbrook bunker entrance was a gaping, concrete maw swallowed by the night. The rain had intensified, masking the sound of the Blackhawk's departure. Connor stood at the threshold of the primary access tunnel, his night vision goggles casting the world in a haunting, monochromatic green. Beside him, Titan stood at the ready. The dog's specialized tactical goggles protected his eyes, and customized, sound-dampening neoprene booties covered his paws to muffle his claws against the concrete. "Comms check," Captain Miller's voice crackled softly in Connor's earpiece from the mobile command center a mile away. "You have a 30-minute window before they start executing hostages. You are green to go." Total silence. "Davies." "Copy," Connor whispered. He dropped to one knee, bringing his face level with Titan's. He didn't use the Navy standard commands. He didn't even use Artie's old override codes. Over the last 14 months, Connor had built something new. "Ghost!" Connor breathed, tapping 2 fingers gently against the side of Titan's snout. "Seek and silence. We go together." Titan didn't growl. He didn't whine. He simply leaned into the touch for a microsecond, then turned toward the black tunnel. He dropped his nose an inch from the ground, his ears swiveling like radar dishes, and moved forward. Connor followed, stepping exactly where the dog stepped, mirroring his agonizingly slow, deliberate pace. 10 yards in, the ambient light vanished entirely. The air grew cold and smelled of damp earth and machine oil. Suddenly, Titan froze. His right front paw hovered in the air. He didn't look back at Connor. He just held the point rigidly. Connor slowly lowered his NVGs and peered down the corridor. Stretched 6 inches above the floor, almost invisible even in the infrared spectrum, was a monofilament tripwire hooked to a block of C4 plastered to the wall. Titan had smelled the explosive compound before Connor could even see the wire. Connor gently tapped Titan's left flank, a silent command to bypass. Titan carefully stepped over the wire, leaving exactly enough room for Connor to do the same. They moved deeper into the earth, a seamless, silent organism bypassing 3 more acoustic traps and a pressure plate that would have vaporized a heavy-footed SWAT team. At the end of the long corridor, the tunnel widened into a large staging bay. Through his optics, Connor spotted the first threat. 2 mercenaries, dressed in dark tactical gear, stood guarding a heavy steel door, their suppressed submachine guns slung lazily across their chests. They were whispering to each other, confident that their traps had secured the perimeter. Connor knew he couldn't shoot. Even a suppressed rifle shot echoed. The acoustic sensors on the walls would pick up the mechanical slap of the bolt carrier group and trigger the explosives. He looked at Titan. The dog had already locked onto the targets. His muscles were coiled, his jaw tight. He was waiting for the release. Connor pointed 2 fingers at the guard on the left, then made a slashing motion across his own chest. It was a kill command, modified for absolute stealth. Titan launched himself into the darkness. Because of the neoprene booties, there was no sound of claws on concrete. 85 pounds of muscle crossed the 30-foot gap in 3 seconds. Titan struck the guard on the left square in the chest, his jaws locking instantly onto the man's throat, crushing his windpipe before he could even draw breath to scream. The second guard spun around, his eyes wide with shock as his partner collapsed backward under the weight of a silent black shadow. He scrambled to raise his weapon, his finger frantically searching for the trigger. Connor was already moving. He closed the distance in a dead sprint, stepping off the wall and driving his combat knife into the side of the second guard's neck, clamping a heavy hand over his mouth to muffle the gargling gasp as the man dropped to the floor. It was over in 5 seconds. No shots fired, no acoustic alarms triggered. Titan stood over the first guard, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his muzzle. The dog looked up at Connor, his eyes blown wide, his breathing accelerating. The coppery smell of fresh blood and the adrenaline of the kill were flooding his system. The ghosts of Zabul were clawing at the edges of his mind. Connor saw the tremor start in Titan's hind legs. The dog's lips twitched, preparing to let out a defensive, panicked bark that would doom them all. Clang. From behind the heavy steel door, a metal tool was dropped by one of the hostages, or the remaining guards inside. The sharp, percussive sound echoed through the concrete bay. It was the exact frequency of a rifle bolt. The ultimate trigger. Titan's head snapped toward the door. The terrifying, chainsaw growl started to vibrate deep in his throat. He was slipping back to the compound in Afghanistan. He was about to break. Connor didn't hesitate. He didn't resort to Artie's old broken arrow code. That was a failsafe to shut the dog down. Connor needed him awake. He needed his partner. Connor dropped his bloody knife, fell to his knees directly in front of the massive, hyperventilating dog, and grabbed Titan by the sides of his harness. "Look at me!" Connor hissed, his voice an intense, raw whisper. "You are not there. You are here. With me. I am your anchor." Titan's jaws snapped at the empty air, his amber eyes glazed with trauma. Connor pressed his forehead directly against Titan's bloody snout. For a breathless, terrifying second, the dog's growl peaked, ready to explode into a deafening bark. But the physical pressure of Connor's forehead, the familiar scent of his handler, and the new, raw frequency in Connor's voice pierced through the chemical storm of PTSD in the dog's brain. Titan blinked, the glaze shattered. The growl died in his throat, replaced by a sharp, controlled exhalation through his nose. He lowered his head, pressing back against Connor's forehead, grounding himself in the present reality. Connor let out a shaky breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gave the dog a single, firm pat on the shoulder. "Good boy," Connor whispered. "Let's finish it." Connor placed a specialized thermal breaching charge, one designed to melt hinges silently rather than blow them outward on the heavy steel door. When the metal gave way, Connor and Titan flooded the room. The remaining 4 mercenaries never stood a chance. Caught completely off guard by the silent breach, 2 were taken down by Titan before they could even unholster their sidearms, and the other 2 surrendered immediately as Connor's rifle laser painted their foreheads. The hostages, bound and terrified in the corner of the munitions bay, wept silently as the young SEAL and the scarred, blood-soaked German shepherd secured the room. 30 minutes later, the FBI hostage rescue team carefully navigated the deactivated tunnel, taking custody of the mercenaries and escorting the hostages to safety. When Connor and Titan finally emerged from the underground bunker into the cool, pre-dawn California air, the rain had stopped. Captain Miller, Dr. Eris, and a swarm of medical personnel were waiting near the mobile command center. Dr. Eris rushed forward with a medical kit, her eyes immediately scanning Titan for fresh bullet wounds. "Is he hit? Davies, is he okay?" Connor unclipped his helmet, letting it hang from his vest. He looked down at the dog. Titan wasn't shaking. He wasn't growling at the approaching medics. He sat perfectly calm at Connor's left heel, his amber eyes scanning the perimeter, confident that his handler had control of the situation. "He's not hit, Doc," Connor said, a tired, genuine smile cracking his dirt-streaked face. "He's perfect." Captain Miller stepped forward, looking at the silent, disciplined animal that had just saved a naval base from complete annihilation. He offered Connor a slow, respectful nod. "You did good, Davies. Both of you." Miller paused, glancing at the dog's classified file resting on the hood of a nearby Humvee. "I'll have the evaluation board officially strike the non-deployable status from his record by 0800. You two are a cleared operational unit." Connor reached down, his fingers brushing the thick, scarred fur behind Titan's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, letting out a soft, contented sigh. He was no longer Artie Hayes' ghost. He was Petty Officer Connor Davies' shield. "We're ready, Captain," Connor replied, watching the sun begin to rise over the horizon. "We've got the watch." The reality of military working dogs is rarely as cinematic, but it is deeply profound. Dogs like the Belgian Malinois and German Shepherds, utilized by Tier 1 units, endure the same physical and psychological traumas as human operators. They suffer from concussions, shrapnel wounds, and complex PTSD. When a dog loses its handler in combat, the psychological fracture can be catastrophic, leading to behavioral issues that traditional veterinary medicine cannot cure with medication alone. Healing requires immense patience, behavioral redirection, and an operator willing to learn the silent, subtle language of canine trauma. The bond forged between a handler and their canine is not built on dominance. It is a vital, living tether rooted in absolute trust and shared survival. It is a reminder that in the darkest corners of human conflict, sometimes the greatest humanity is demonstrated by those with 4 legs.